Chapter 8 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 8 Bread from the Waters. The next day, worn out from loss of sleep, the young man started out upon a last frenzied search for employment. He had no money for breakfast, and so he went breakfastless. And as he had no car fare, it was necessary for him to walk the seemingly interminable miles from one prospective job to another. By the middle of the afternoon, Jimmy was hungrier than he had ever been before in his life. He was so hungry that it actually hurt, and he was weak from physical fatigue and from disappointment and worry. "I've got to eat," he soliloquized fiercely. "If I have to go out tonight and pound somebody on the head to get the price, and I'm going to do it," he concluded as the odors of cooking food came to him from a cheap restaurant which he was passing. He stopped a moment and looked into the window at the catsup bottles and sad-looking pies, which the proprietor apparently seemed to think formed an artistic and attractive window display. "If I had a brick," thought Jimmy, "I would have one of those pies, even if I went to the jug for it." But his hunger had not made him as desperate as he thought he was, and so he passed slowly on, and glancing into the windows of the store next door, saw a display of second-hand clothes and the sign, "Clothes Bought and Sold." Jimmy looked at those in the window and then down at his own, which, though wrinkled, were infinitely better than anything on display. "I wonder," he mused, "if I couldn't put something over in the way of high finance here." And acting upon the inspiration, he entered the dingy little shop. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he wore a shabby and rather disreputable suit of hand-me-downs, but he had $2 in his pocket. When Jimmy returned to his room that night, it was with a full stomach, but with the knowledge that he had practically reached the end of his rope. He had been unable to bring himself to the point of writing his father an admission of his failure, and in fact he had gone so far and in his estimation had sunk so low that he had definitely determined he would rather starve to death now than admit his utter inefficiency to those whose respect he most valued. As he climbed the stairway to his room, he heard someone descending from above, and as they passed beneath the dim light of a flickering gas jet, he realized that the other stopped suddenly and turned back to look after him as Jimmy continued his ascent of the stairs. And then a low voice inquired, "Say, Bo, what you doing here?" Jimmy turned toward the questioner. "Oh," he exclaimed as recognition of the other dawned slowly upon him. "It's you, is it? My old and esteemed friend, the Lizard." "Sure it's me," replied the Lizard. "What you doing here? Looking for a assistant general manager?" Jimmy grinned. "Don't rub it in," he said, still smiling. The other ascended toward him, his keen eyes appraising him from head to foot. "You live here?" he asked. "Yes," replied Jimmy. "Do you?" "Sure. I've been living here for the last 6 months." "That's funny," said Jimmy. "I have been here about 2 months myself." "What's the matter with you?" asked the Lizard. "Didn't you like the job as general manager?" Jimmy flushed. "Forget it," he admonished. "Where's your room?" asked the Lizard. "Up another flight," said Jimmy. "Won't you come up?" "Sure," said the Lizard. And together the two ascended the stairs and entered Jimmy's room. Under the brighter light there the Lizard scrutinized his host. "You've been against it, Bo, haven't you?" he asked. "I sure have," said Jimmy. "Gee," said the other, "what a difference clothes make. You look like a regular bum." "Thanks," said Jimmy. "What you doing?" asked the Lizard. "Nothing." "Lose your job?" "I quit it," said Jimmy. "I've only worked a month since I've been here, and that for the munificent salary of $10 a week." "Do you want to make some coin?" asked the Lizard. "I sure do," said Jimmy. "I don't know of anything I would rather have." "I'm pulling off something tomorrow night. I can use you," and he eyed Jimmy shrewdly as he spoke. "Cracking a box?" asked Jimmy, grinning. It might be something like that," replied the Lizard. "But you won't have nothing to do but stand there where I put you and make a noise like a cat if you see anybody coming. It ought to be something good. I've been working on it for 3 months. We'll split something like 50,000, 30, 70." "Is that the usual percentage?" asked Jimmy. "It's what I'm offering you," replied the Lizard. 30% of $50,000. Jimmy jiggled the few pieces of silver remaining in his pocket. $15,000. And here he had been walking his legs off and starving in a vain attempt to earn a few paltry dollars honestly. "There's something wrong somewhere," muttered Jimmy to himself. "I'm taking it from an old crab who has more than he can use, and all of it he got by robbing people that didn't have any to spare. He's a big guy here. When anything big is doing, the newspaper guys interview him, and his name is in all the lists of subscriptions to charity when they're going to be published in the papers. I'll bet he takes 9/10 of his scale from women and children, and he's an honored citizen. I ain't no angel, but whatever I've taken didn't cause nobody any suffering. I'm a thief, Bo, and I'm mighty proud of it when I think of what this other guy is." 30% of $50,000. Jimmy was sitting with his legs crossed. He looked down at his ill-fitting, shabby trousers and then turned up the sole of one shoe, which was worn through almost to his sock. The Lizard watched him as a cat watches a mouse. He knew that the other was thinking hard and that presently he would reach a decision, and through Jimmy's mind marched a sordid and hateful procession of recent events: humiliation, rebuff, shame, poverty, hunger, and in the background the face of his father and the face of a girl whose name even he did not know. Presently he looked up at the Lizard. "Nothing doing, old top," he said, "but don't mistake the motives which prompt me to refuse your glittering offer. I am moved by no moral scruples, however humiliating such a confession should be. The way I feel now, I would almost as lief go out and rob widows and orphans myself. But each of us, sometime in our life, has to consider someone who would probably rather see us dead than disgraced. I don't know whether you get me or not." "I get you," replied the Lizard. "And while you may never wear diamonds, you'll get more pleasure out of life than I ever will, provided you don't starve to death too soon. You know, I had a hunch you would turn me down, and I'm glad you did. If you were going crooked sometime, I thought I'd like to have you with me. When it comes to men, I'm a pretty good picker. That's the reason I've kept out of jail so long. I either pick a square one or I work alone." "Thanks," said Jimmy. "But how do you know that after you pull this job I won't tip off the police and claim the reward?" The Lizard grinned his lip grin. "There ain't one chance in a million," he said. "You'd starve to death before you'd do it. And now, what you want is a job. I can probably get you one if you ain't too particular." "I'll do anything," said Jimmy, "that I could do and still look a policeman in the face." "All right," said the Lizard. "When I come back, I'll bring you a job of some sort. I may be back tonight, and I may not be back again for a month. And in the meantime, you got to live." He drew a roll of bills from his pocket and commenced to count out several. "Hold on," cried Jimmy. "Once again, nothing doing." "Forget it," admonished the Lizard. "I'm just paying back the 20 you loaned me." "But I didn't loan it to you," said Jimmy. "I gave it to you as a reward for finding my watch." The Lizard laughed and shoved the money across the table. "Take it," he said. "Don't be a damn fool. And now, so long. I may bring you home a job tonight, and if I don't, you got enough to live on for a couple of weeks." After the Lizard had gone, Jimmy sat looking at the $20 for a long time. "That fellow may be a thief," he soliloquized, "but whatever he is, he's white. Just imagine, the only friend I've got in Chicago is a safe blower." End of chapter 8. Of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 9. Harold Sits in a Game. When Elizabeth Compton broached to her father the subject of a much-needed rest and a trip to the Orient, he laughed at her. "Why, girl," he cried, "I was never better in my life. Where in the world did you get this silly idea?"
"Harold noticed it first," she replied, "and called my attention to it, and now I can see that you really have been failing."
"Failing!" ejaculated Compton with a scoff. "Failing nothing. You're a pair of young idiots. I'm good for 20 years more of hard work, but as I told Harold, I would like to quit and travel, and I shall do so just as soon as I am convinced that he can take my place."
"Couldn't he do it now?"
asked the girl. No, I'm afraid not," replied Compton. "It is too much to expect of him, but I believe that in another year he will be able to." And so Compton put an end to the suggestion that he travel for his health, and that night when Bince called she told him that she had been unable to persuade her father that he needed a rest. "I am afraid," he said, "that you don't take it seriously enough yourself, and that you fail to impress upon him the real gravity of his condition. It is really necessary that he go. He must go." The girl looked up quickly at the speaker, whose tone seemed unnecessarily vehement.
"I don't quite understand," she said. "Why should you take the matter so to heart? Father is the best judge of his own condition, and while he may need a rest, I cannot see that he is in any immediate danger." "Oh, well," replied Bince irritably, "I just wanted him to get away for his own sake. Of course, it don't mean anything to me." "What's the matter with you tonight, anyway, Harold?" she asked half an hour later. "You're as cross and disagreeable as you can be."
"No, I'm not," he said. "There is nothing the matter with me at all."
But his denial failed to convince her, and as, unusually early, a few minutes later he left, she realized that she had spent a most unpleasant evening. Bince went directly to his club, where he found 4 other men who were evidently waiting for him. "Want to sit down in a little game tonight, Harold?" asked one of them.
"No hell," replied Bince. "You fellows have been sitting here all evening waiting for me. You know I want to. My luck's got to change sometime."
"Sure thing it has," agreed another of the men. "You certainly have been playing in rotten luck, but when it does change, oh, baby."
As the 5 men entered one of the card rooms, several of the inevitable spectators drew away from the other games and approached their table, for it was a matter of club gossip that these 5 played for the largest stakes of any coterie among the habitués of the card room. It was 2 o'clock in the morning before Bince disgustedly threw his cards upon the table and rose. There was a nasty expression on his face, and in his mind a thing which he did not dare voice, the final crystallization of a suspicion that he had long harbored, that his companions had been for months deliberately fleecing him. Tonight he had lost $5,000. Nor was there a man at the table who did not hold his IOUs for similar amounts. "I'm through, absolutely through," he said. "I'll be damned if I ever touch another card." His companions only smiled wearily, for they knew that tomorrow night he would be back at the table.
"How much of old man Compton's money did you get tonight?" asked one of the 4 after Bince had left the room.
"About $2,000, was the reply, which, added to what I already hold, puts Mr. Compton in my debt some $7,000 or $8,000.
Whereupon they all laughed.
"I suppose," remarked another, "that it's a damn shame. But if we don't get it, someone else will." "Is he paying anything at all?" asked another. "Oh, yes, he comes across with something now and then, but we'll probably have to carry the bulk of it until after the wedding." "Well, I can't carry it forever," said the first speaker. "I'm not playing here for my health." And rising, he too left the room.
Going directly to the buffet, he found Bince, as he was quite sure that he would.
"Look here, old man," he said. "I hate to seem insistent, but on the level I've got to have some money."
"I've told you 2 or 3 times," replied Bince, "that I'd let you have it as soon as I could get it. I can't get you any now."
"If you haven't got it, Mason Compton has," retorted the creditor. "And if you don't come across, I'll go to him and get it."
Bince paled. "You wouldn't do that, Harry?" he almost whimpered. "For God's sake, don't do that. And I'll try and see what I can do for you."
"Well," replied the other, "I don't want to be nasty, but I need some money badly."
"Give me a little longer," begged Bince, "and I'll see what I can do."
Jimmy Torrance sat a long time in thought after the Lizard left.
"God," he muttered, "I wonder what Dad would say if he knew that I had come to a point where I had even momentarily considered going into partnership with a safe blower, and that for the next 2 weeks I shall be compelled to subsist upon the charity of a criminal. I'm sure glad that I have a college education. It has helped me materially to win my present exalted standing in society. Well, I might be worse off, I suppose. At least I don't have to worry about the income tax. It is now October, and since the first of the year I have earned $40 exactly. I have also received a bequest of $20, which of course is exempt. I venture to say that there's not another able-bodied adult male in the United States, the making of whose income tax schedule would be simpler than mine."
With which philosophic trend of thought and the knowledge that he could eat for at least 2 weeks longer, the erstwhile star amateur first baseman sought the doubtful comfort of his narrow, lumpy bed. It was in the neighborhood of 2 o'clock the next morning that he was awakened by a gentle tapping upon the panels of his door.
"Who is it?" he asked.
"Oh, what do you want?"
"It's me, Bo,"
came the whispered reply in the unmistakable tones of the Lizard. Jimmy arose, lighted the gas, and opened the door.
"What's the matter?" he whispered. "Are the police on your trail?" "No," replied the Lizard, grinning. "I just dropped in to tell you that I grabbed a job for you."
"Fine!" exclaimed Jimmy. "You're a regular fellow, all right.
But you might not like the job," suggested the Lizard.
"As long as I can earn an honest dollar," cried Jimmy, striking a dramatic pose, "I care not what it may be."
The Lizard's grin broadened. "I ain't so sure about that," he said. "I know your kind. You're a regular gent. There's some honest jobs that you would just as soon have as the smallpox, and maybe this is one of them."
"What is it?" asked Jimmy. "Don't keep me guessing any longer."
"You know Feinheimer's Cabaret?"
"The basement joint on Wells Street?" asked Jimmy. "Sure, I know it."
"Well, that's where I got you a job," said the Lizard.
"What doing?" asked Jimmy.
"Waiter," was the reply.
"It isn't any worse than standing behind a counter selling stockings to women," said Jimmy.
"It ain't such a bad job," admitted the Lizard, "if a guy ain't too swelled up. Some of 'em make a pretty good thing out of it, what with their tips and short-changing. Oh, there are lots of little ways to get yours at Feinheimer's."
"I see," said Jimmy. "But don't he pay any wages?"
"Oh, sure," replied the Lizard. "You get the union scale."
"When do I go to work?"
"Go around and see him tomorrow morning. He will put you right to work."
And so the following evening the patrons of Feinheimer's Cabaret saw a new face among the untidy servitors of the establishment, a new face and a new figure, both of which looked out of place in the atmosphere of the basement resort. Feinheimer's Cabaret held a unique place among the restaurants of the city. Its patrons were from all classes of society. At noon its many tables were largely filled by staid and respectable business men, but at night a certain element of the underworld claimed it as their own, and there was always a sprinkling of people of the stage, artists, literary men, and politicians.
It was, as a certain wit described it, a social goulash, for in addition to its regular habitués, there were those few who came occasionally from the upper stratum of society in the belief that they were doing something devilish. As a matter of fact, slumming parties which began and ended at Feinheimer's were of no uncommon occurrence, and as the place was more than usually orderly, it was with the greatest safety that society made excursions into the underworld of crime and vice through its medium. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 10. At Feinheimer's. Feinheimer liked Jimmy's appearance. He was big and strong, and the fact that Feinheimer always retained one or two powerful men upon his payroll accounted in a large measure for the orderliness of his place. Occasionally one might start something at Feinheimer's, but no one was ever known to finish what he started. And so Jimmy found himself waiting upon table at a place that was both reputable and disreputable, serving businessmen at noon and criminals and the women of the underworld at night. In the weeks that he was there, he came to know many of the local celebrities in various walks of life, to know them at least by name. There was Steve Murray, the labor leader, whom rumor said was one of Feinheimer's financial backers, a large man with a loud voice and the table manners of a Duroc Jersey. Jimmy took an instinctive dislike to the man the first time he saw him. And then there was little Eva, whose real name was Edith. She was a demure-looking little girl who came in every afternoon at 4 o'clock for her breakfast. She usually came to Jimmy's table when it was vacant, and at 4 o'clock she always ate alone. Later in the evening she would come in again with a male escort, who was never twice the same. "I wonder what's the matter with me," she said to Jimmy one day as he was serving her breakfast. "I'm getting awfully nervous." "That's quite remarkable," said Jimmy. "I should think anyone who smoked as many cigarettes and drank as much whiskey as you would have perfect nerves." The girl laughed, a rather soft and mellow laugh. "I suppose I do hit it up a little strong," she said. "Strong!" exclaimed Jimmy. "Why, if I drank half of what you do, I'd be in the Washingtonian Home in a week." She looked at him quizzically for a moment, as she had looked at him often since he had gone to work for Feinheimer. "You're a funny guy," she said. "I can't quite figure you out. What are you doing here, anyway?" "I never claimed to be much of a waiter," said Jimmy, "but I didn't know I was so rotten that a regular customer of the place couldn't tell what I was trying to do." "Oh, go on," she cried. "I didn't mean that. These other hash slingers around here look the part. Aside from that, about the only thing they know how to do is to roll a souse. But you're different." "Yes," said Jimmy, "I am different. My abilities are limited. All I can do is wait on table, while they have two accomplishments." "Oh, you don't have to tell me," said the girl. "I wasn't rubbering. I was just sort of interested in you." "Thanks," said Jimmy. She went on with her breakfast while Jimmy set up an adjoining table. Presently, when he came to fill her water glass, she looked up at him again. "I like you, kid," she said. "You're not fresh. You know what I am as well as the rest of them, but you wait on me just the same as you would on She hesitated, and there was a little catch in her voice as she finished the sentence. "Just the same as you would on a decent girl." Jimmy looked at her in surprise. It was the first indication that he had ever had from an habitué of Feinheimer's that there might lurk within their breasts anything of the finer characteristics whose outward indices are pride and shame. He was momentarily at a loss as to what to say, and as he hesitated the girl's gaze went past him and she exclaimed, "Look who's here." Jimmy turned to look at the newcomer and saw the Lizard directly behind him. "Howdy, Bo," said his benefactor. "I thought I'd come in and give you the once-over. And here's little Eva with a plate of ham and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon."
The Lizard dropped into a chair at the table with the girl, and after Jimmy had taken his order and departed for the kitchen, little Eva jerked her thumb toward his retreating figure. "Friend of yours?" she asked. "He might have a worse friend," replied the Lizard noncommittally. "What's his graft?" asked the girl. "He ain't got none except being on the square." "It's funny," the Lizard philosophized. "But here's me with a bank roll that would choke a horse, and you probably got a stocking full of dough, and I'll bet all the money I ever had or ever expect to have, if one of us could change places with that poor simp, we'd do it." "He is a square guy, isn't he?" said the girl. "You can almost tell it by looking at him. How did you come to know him?" "Oh, that's a long story," said the Lizard. "We room at the same place, but I knew him before that." "On Indiana near 18th?" asked the girl. "How the hell did you know?" he queried. "I know a lot of things I ain't supposed to know," replied she. "You're a wise guy, all right, Eva. One thing I like about you is that you don't let anything you know hurt you." And then, after a pause, "I like him," she said. "What's his name?" The Lizard eyed her for a moment. "Don't you get to liking him too much," he said. "That bird's the class. He ain't for any little—" "Cut it!" exclaimed the girl. "I'm as good as you are, and a damn sight straighter. What I get, I earn. I don't steal it." The Lizard grinned. "I guess you're right at that. But don't try to pull him down any lower than he is. He is coming up again some day to where he belongs." "I ain't going to try to pull him down," said the girl. "And anyhow, when were you made his godfather?" Jimmy saw Eva almost daily for many weeks. He saw her at her post-meridian breakfast, sober and subdued. He saw her later in the evening in various stages of exhilaration, but at those times she did not come to his table, and seldom if ever did he catch her eye. They talked a great deal while she breakfasted, and he learned to like the girl and to realize that she possessed two personalities. The one which he liked dominated her at breakfast. The other, which he loathed, guided her actions later in the evening. Neither of them ever referred to those hours of her life, and as the days passed, Jimmy found himself looking forward to the hour when little Eva would come to Feinheimer's for her breakfast. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 11. Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Eve. Elizabeth Compton and Harriet Holden were completing the rounds of their friend's home with Christmas remembrances, a custom that had continued since childhood. The last parcel had been delivered upon the south side, and they were now being driven north on Michigan Boulevard toward home. Elizabeth directed the chauffeur to turn over Van Buren to State, which at this season of the year was almost alive with belated Christmas shoppers and those other thousands who always seize upon the slightest pretext for a celebration. It was a noisy, joyous crowd whose spirit, harmonizing with the bright lights and the gay shop windows, infected all who came within its influence. As the car moved slowly northward along the world's greatest retail street, the girls leaned forward to watch the passing throng through the windows. "Isn't it wonderful?" exclaimed Harriet. "What transformation a few lights make! Who would ever think a State Street is a fairyland? And yet, if you half close your eyes, the hallucination is complete. Even the people who by daylight are shoddy and careworn take on an appearance of romance and gaiety, and the tawdry-colored lights are the scintillant gems of the garden of a fairy prince." "Don't," Elizabeth pleaded. "The city night always affects me. It makes me want to do something adventurous, and on Christmas Eve it's even worse. If you keep on like that, I shall soon be telling David to drive us up and down State Street all night." "I wish we didn't have to go home right away," said Harriet. "I feel like doing something devilish." "Well, let's," exclaimed Elizabeth. "Do something devilish?" inquired Harriet. "What, for instance?" "Oh, most anything that we shouldn't do," replied Elizabeth. "And there isn't anything that we could do down here alone that we should do." They both laughed. "I have it!" exclaimed Elizabeth suddenly. "We'll be utterly abandoned. We'll have supper at Feinheimer's without an escort." Harriet cast a horrified glance at her companion. "Why, Elizabeth Compton," she cried, "you wouldn't dare. You know you wouldn't dare." "Do you dare me?" asked the other. "But suppose someone should see us," argued Harriet. "Your father would never forgive us." "If we see anyone in Feinheimer's who knows us," argued Elizabeth shrewdly, "they will be just as glad to forget it as we. And anyway, it will do no harm. I shall have David stay right outside the door so that if I call him he can come. I don't know what I would do without David. He's a sort of Rock of Ages and Gibraltar all in one." Through the speaking tube, Elizabeth directed David to drive to Feinheimer's, and whatever David may have thought of the order, he gave no outward indication of it. Christmas Eve at Feinheimer's is, or was, a riot of unconfined hilarity, although the code of ethics of the place was on a higher plane than that which governed the Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve patrons of so-called respectable restaurants, where a woman is not safe from insult, even though she be properly escorted, while in Feinheimer's a woman with an escort was studiously avoided by the other celebrators, unless she chose to join with them. As there was only one class of women who came to Feinheimer's at night without escort, the male habitués had no difficulty in determining who they might approach and who they might not. Jimmy Torrance was as busy as a cranberry merchant. He had 4 tables to attend to, and while the amount of food he served grew more and more negligible as the evening progressed, his trips to the bar were exceedingly frequent. One of his tables had been vacated for a few minutes when, upon his return from the bar with a round of drinks for Steve Murray and his party, he saw that 2 women had entered and were occupying his 4th table. Their backs were toward him, and he gave them but little attention other than to note that they were unescorted and to immediately catalogue them accordingly. Having distributed Steve Murray's order, Jimmy turned toward his new patrons, and laying a menu card before each, he stood between them waiting for their order. "What shall we take?" asked Elizabeth of Harriet. Then, "What have you that's good?" and she looked up at the waiter. Jimmy prided himself upon self-control, and his serving at Feinheimer's had still further schooled him in the repression of any outward indication of his emotions. For, as most men of his class, he had a well-defined conception of what constituted a perfect waiter, one of the requisites being utter indifference to any of the affairs of his patrons outside of those things which actually pertained to his duties as a servitor. But in this instance Jimmy realized that he had come very close to revealing the astonishment which he felt on seeing this girl in Feinheimer's, and unescorted. If Jimmy was schooled in self-control, Elizabeth Compton was equally so. She recognized the waiter immediately, but not even by a movement of an eyelid did she betray the fact, which may possibly be accounted for by the fact that it meant little more to her than as though she had chanced to see the same street sweeper several times in succession, although after he had left with their order, she asked Harriet if she too had recognized him. "Immediately," replied her friend. "It doesn't seem possible that such a good-looking chap should be occupying such a menial position." "Oh, there must be something wrong with him," rejoined Elizabeth. "Probably utterly inefficient." "Or he may have some vice," suggested Harriet. "It doesn't look it," said Elizabeth. "He looks too utterly healthy for that. We've seen some of these drug addicts in our own set, as you may readily recall. No, I shouldn't say that he was that." "I suppose the poor fellow has never had an opportunity," said Harriet. "He has a good face, his eyes and forehead indicate intelligence, and his jaw is strong and aggressive. Probably, though, he was raised in poverty and knows nothing better than what he's doing now. It is too bad that some of these poor creatures couldn't have the advantages of a higher education." "Yes," said Elizabeth, "it is too bad. Take a man like that. With a college education, he could attain almost any degree of success he chose.
"He certainly could," agreed Harriet. And then suddenly, What's the matter, Elizabeth? Your face is perfectly scarlet."
The other girl tapped the floor with the toe of one boot impatiently.
"That horrid creature at the next table just winked at me," she said disgustedly.
Harriet looked about in the direction her companion had indicated to see a large, overdressed man staring at them. There was a smirk on his face, and as Harriet caught his eye, she saw him rise and, to her horror, realize that he was advancing toward their table. He stopped in front of them with his huge hands resting on the edge of their table and looked down at Elizabeth.
"Hello, kiddo," he said. "What are you going to drink?"
Elizabeth gave the man one look such as would utterly have frozen a male from her own stratum of society, but it had as little effect upon Steve Murray's self-assurance as the cork from a pop-gun would have had on the armored side of a rhinoceros.
"All right," said the man. "What's the use of asking? There's only one thing when Steve Murray buys. Here, waiter," he yelled, pounding on the table.
The nearest waiter, who chanced not to be Jimmy, who was then in the kitchen, came hurriedly forward.
"Open up some wine," commanded Murray. "Come on, boys, bring your chairs over here," he continued, addressing his companions. "Let's have a little party."
Elizabeth Compton rose.
"You will oblige me," she said, "by leaving our table."
Steve Murray laughed uproariously. He had dropped into a chair next to hers.
"That's great," he cried. "I guess you don't know who I am, kiddo. You won't cop off anything better in this joint than Steve Murray. Come on, let's be friends. That's a good girl."
And before Elizabeth realized the man's intentions, he had seized her wrist and pulled her down into his lap. It was this scene that broke upon Jimmy's view as he emerged from the kitchen with a laden tray. He saw Steve Murray seize the girl, and he saw her struggling to free herself. And then there was a mighty crash as Jimmy dropped the tray of steaming food upon the floor and ran quickly forward. Murray was endeavoring to draw the girl's lips to his as Jimmy's hand shot between their faces and pushed that of the man away. With his free arm he encircled the girl's body and attempted to draw her from her assailant. "Cut it, Murray," he commanded in a low tone of voice. "She isn't your sort."
"Who the hell are you?" cried the labor leader, releasing the girl and rising to his feet. "Get the hell out of here, you dirty hash slinger. Any girl in this place belongs to me if I want her. There don't only one kind come in here without an escort, or with one either, for that matter. You get back to your job where you belong."
And the man pressed forward, trying to push Jimmy aside and lay hands on Elizabeth again. Jimmy did not strike him then. He merely placed the palm of one hand against the man's breast and pushed him backward, but with such force that, striking a chair, Steve Murray fell backward and sprawled upon the floor. Scrambling to his feet, he rushed Jimmy like a mad bull. In his younger days, Murray had been a boilermaker, and he still retained most of his great strength. He was a veritable mountain of a man, and now in the throes of a berserker rage he was a formidable opponent. His face was white, and his lips were drawn back tightly, exposing his teeth in a bestial snarl as he charged at Jimmy. His great arms and huge hands beat to the right and left like enormous flails, one blow from which might seemingly have felled an ox. Torrance had stood for a moment with an arm still around the girl, but as Murray rose to his feet, he pushed her gently behind him, and then as the man was upon him, Jimmy ducked easily under the other's clumsy left and swung a heavy right hook to his jaw. As Murray staggered to the impact of the blow, Jimmy reached him again quickly and easily with a left to the nose, from which a crimson burst spattered over the waiter and his victim. Murray went backward and would have fallen, but for the fact he came in contact with one of his friends, and then he was at Jimmy again. By this time, waiters and patrons were crowding forward from all parts of the room, and Feinheimer, shrieking at the top of his voice, was endeavoring to worm his fat, toad-like body through the cordon of excited spectators. The proprietor reached the scene of carnage just in time to see Jimmy plant a lovely left on the point of Murray's jaw. The big man tottered drunkenly for an instant, his knees sagged, and as Jimmy stood in readiness for any eventuality, the other crashed heavily to the floor. Towering above the others in the room suddenly came a big young fellow, shouldering his way through the crowd, a young man in the uniform of a chauffeur. Elizabeth saw him before he discovered her.
"Oh, David," she cried. "Quick, quick, take us out of here."
As the chauffeur reached her side and took in the scene, he jerked his head toward Jimmy.
"Did anyone hurt you, miss?"
"No, no," she cried. "This man has been very kind. Just get us out of here, David, as quickly as you can."
And turning to Jimmy,
"How can I ever repay you? If it hadn't been for you, oh, I hate to think what would have happened. Come out to the car and give David your name and address, and I will send you something tomorrow."
"Oh, that's all right," said Jimmy. "You just get out of here as quick as you can. If the police happen to look in now, you might be held as a witness."
"Oh, how utterly horrible!" exclaimed Elizabeth. "Come, David. Come, Harriet."
David making a way for her, she started for the door. Harriet paused long enough to extend her hand to Jimmy.
"It was wonderfully brave of you," she said. "We could never do enough to repay you. My name is Harriet Holden."
And she gave him an address on Lakeshore Drive.
"If you will come Monday morning about 10 o'clock, she said, "I am sure that there's something we can do for you. If you want a better position," she half suggested, "I know my father could help, although he must never know about this tonight."
"Thanks," said Jimmy, smiling. "It's awfully good of you, but you must hurry now. There goes your friend." Feinheimer stood as one dazed, looking down at the bulk of his friend and associate.
"Mein Gott!" he cried. "What kind of a place you think I run, young man?" He turned angrily on Jimmy. "What do you think I hire you for, to beat up my best customer?"
"He got what was coming to him," said a soft feminine voice at Jimmy's elbow.
The man looked to see little Eva standing at his side.
"I didn't think anybody could do that to Murray," she continued. "Lord, but it was pretty. He's had it coming to him ever since I've known him. But the big stiff had everybody around the joint buffaloed. He got away with anything he started."
Feinheimer looked at little Eva disgustedly.
"He's my best customer," he cried, "and a bum waiter comes along and beats him up just when he's trying to have a little innocent sport on Christmas Eve. You take off your apron, young man, and get your time. I won't have no rough stuff in Feinheimer's."
Jimmy shrugged his shoulders and grinned. "Shouldn't I wait to see if I can't do something more for Mr. Murray?" he suggested.
"You get out of here!" cried Feinheimer. "Get out of here, or I'll call the police."
Jimmy laughed and took off his apron as he walked back to the servants' coat room. As he emerged again and crossed through the dining room, he saw that Murray had regained consciousness and was sitting at a table wiping the blood from his face with a wet napkin. As Murray's eyes fell upon his late antagonist, he half rose from his chair and shook his fist at Jimmy.
"I'll get you with this, young fella," he yelled. "I'll get you yet, and don't you forget it."
"You just had me," Jimmy called back, "but it didn't seem to make you very happy." He could still hear Murray fuming and cursing as he passed out into the bar room, at the front of which was Feinheimer's office. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 12. Up or Down. After Jimmy had received his check and was about to leave, a couple of men approached him.
"We've seen that little mix-up in there," said one of them. "You handle your mitts like you've been there before."
"Yes," said Jimmy, smiling. "I've had a little experience in the manly art of self-defense." The two men were sizing him up.
"Feinheimer can you?" asked one of them.
Jimmy nodded affirmatively.
"Got anything else in view?"
"No," said Jimmy. "How'd you like a job as one of Brophy's sparring partners?" "I wouldn't mind," said Jimmy. "What is there in it?" They named a figure that was entirely satisfactory to Jimmy.
"Come over the day after Christmas," he was told, "and we'll give you a trial."
"I wonder," thought Jimmy as he started for home, "if I have gone up a notch in the social scale or down a notch. From the viewpoint of the underworld, a pug occupies a more exalted position than a waiter, but, well,
A job's a job, and at least I won't have to look at that greasy Feinheimer all day." At 10 o'clock Monday, Jimmy was at young Brophy's training quarters, for although he had not forgotten Harriet Holden's invitation, he had never seriously considered availing himself of her offer to help him to a better position, while he had not found it difficult to accept the rough friendship and assistance of the Lizard. The idea of becoming an object of charity, as he considered it, at the hands of a girl in the same walk of life as that to which he belonged, was intolerable. Young Brophy's manager, whom Jimmy discovered to be one of the men who had accosted him in Feinheimer's after his trouble with Murray, took him into a private office and talked with him confidentially for a half hour before he was definitely employed. It seemed that one of the principal requisites of the position was a willingness to take punishment without attempting to inflict too much upon young Brophy. The manager did not go into specific details as to the reason for this restriction, and Jimmy, badly in need of a job, felt no particular inclination to search too deeply for the root of the matter. "What I don't know," he soliloquized, "won't hurt me any." But he had not been there many days before the piecing together of chance remarks and the gossip of the hangers-on and other sparring partners made it very apparent why Brophy should not be badly manhandled. As it finally revealed itself to Jimmy, it was very simple indeed. Brophy was to be pitted against a man whom he had already outpointed in a former bout. He was the ruling favorite in the betting, and it was the intention to keep him so, while he and his backers quietly placed all their money on the other man. One of the sparring partners, who seemed to harbor a petty grudge against Brophy, finally explained the whole plan to Jimmy. Everything was to be done to carry the impression to the public through the newspapers, who were usually well represented at the training quarters, that Brophy was in the pink of condition, that he was training hard, that it was impossible to find men who could stand up to him on account of the terrific punishment he inflicted upon his sparring partners, and that the result of the fight was already a foregone conclusion. And then, in the third round, young Brophy was to lie down, and by reclining peacefully on his stomach for 10 seconds, make more money than several years of hard and conscientious work earnestly performed could ever net him. It was all very, very simple, but how easily public opinion might be changed should one of the sparring partners really make a good stand against Brophy in the presence of members of the newspaper fraternity. "I see," said Jimmy, running his fingers through his hair. "Oh, well, it's none of my business, and if the suckers want to bet their money on a prize fight, they're about due to lose it anyway." And so he continued permitting himself to be battered up 4 or 5 times a week at the hands of the pussy Mr. Brophy. He paid back the 20 the Lizard had loaned him, got his watch out of pawn, and was even figuring on a new suit of clothes. Never before in his life had Jimmy realized what it meant to be prosperous, since for obvious reasons young Brophy's manager was extremely liberal in the matter of salaries with all those concerned with the training camp. At first it had been rather humiliating to Jimmy to take the drubbings he did at the hands of young Brophy in the presence of the audience which usually filled the small gymnasium where the fighter was training. It was nearly always about the same crowd, however, made up of dyed-in-the-wool fans, a few newspaper men, and a sprinkling of thrill-seekers from other walks of life far removed from the prize ring. Jimmy often noticed women among the spectators, well-dressed women, with every appearance of refinement, and there were always men of the same upper class of society. He mentioned the fact once to the same young man who had previously explained the plan under which the fight was to be faked. "That's just part of the graft," said his informant. "These birds have got next to a bunch of would-be sports with more money than brains through the athletic director of—" he mentioned the name of one of the big athletic clubs. "And they've been inviting them here to watch Brophy training. Every one of the simps will be trying to get money down on Brophy, and this bunch will take it up as fast as they come. The betting hasn't really started yet, and in fact they're holding off themselves until the odds are better. If Brophy goes into the ring a 3-to-1 favorite, these fellows will make a killing that'll be talked of for the next 20 years. "And incidentally give boxing another black eye," interjected Jimmy.
"Oh, what the hell do we care?" said the other. "I'm going to make mine out of it, and you better do the same. I'm going to put up every cent I can borrow or steal on the other guy."
It was Saturday, the 15th of January, just a week before the fight, that Jimmy, trained now almost to perfection, stepped into the ring to take his usual mauling. For some time past there had been insidiously working its way into his mind a vast contempt for the pugilistic prowess of young Brophy. "If," thought Jimmy, "this bird is of championship caliber, I might be a champion myself." For, though young Brophy was not a champion, the newspapers had been pointing to him for some time as a likely possibility for these pugilistic honors later. As this mental attitude grew within him and took hold of Jimmy, it more and more irked him to take the punishment which he inwardly felt he could easily inflict upon Brophy instead. But, as Jimmy had learned through lean and hungry months, a job is a job, and no job is to be sneezed at or lightly thrown aside. There was quite a gathering that afternoon to watch young Brophy's workout, and rather a larger representation than usual from society's younger set. The program, which had consisted in part of shadow boxing and bag punching by young Brophy, was to terminate with 3 rounds with Jimmy. For 2 rounds the young man had permitted Brophy to make a monkey of him, hitting him where he would at will, while Jimmy, as a result of several weeks of diligent practice, was able to put up apparently a very ferocious attempt to annihilate his opponent without doing the latter any material damage. At the close of the 2nd round, Brophy landed a particularly vicious right, which dropped Jimmy to the canvas. The crowd applauded vociferously, and as the gong sounded, as Jimmy was slowly rising to his feet, they were all assured that it was all that had saved the young man from an even worse thrashing. As Jimmy returned to his corner, there arose within him a determination to thrash young Brophy within an inch of his life after the big fight was out of the way and Jimmy no longer bound by any obligations, for he realized that for some reason Brophy had just gone a little too far with his rough tactics, there having been in the arrangement with the sparring partners an understanding that when a knockdown was to be staged, Brophy was to give his opponent the cue. No cue had been given, however. Jimmy had not been expecting it, and he had been floored with a punch behind which were all the weight and brawn of the pugilist. He had long since ceased to consider what the spectators might think. So far as Jimmy was concerned, they might have been so many chairs. He was merely angry at the unnecessary punishment that had been inflicted. As he sprawled in his corner, he let his eyes run over the faces of the spectators directly in front of him, to whom previously he had paid no particular attention, and even now it was scarcely more than an involuntary glance. But his eyes stopped suddenly upon a face, and as recognition suddenly dawned upon him, he could feel the hot blood rushing to his own. For there was the girl whom fate had thrice thrown in his path. Beside her he recognized the Miss Harriet Holden, who had been with her the night at Feinheimer's, and with them 2 young men. Something within Jimmy Torrance rebelled to a point where it utterly dominated him, rebelled at the thought that this girl, whom he had unconsciously set upon a pedestal to worship from afar, should always find him in some menial and humiliating position. It was bad enough that she should see him as a sparring partner of a professional pug, but it made it infinitely worse that she should see him as what he must appear, an unsuccessful 3rd or 4th-rate fighter. Everything within Jimmy's mind turned suddenly topsy-turvy. He seemed to lose all sense of proportion and all sense of value in one overpowering thought, that he must not again be humiliated in her presence. And so it was that at the tap of the gong for the 3rd round, it was not Torrance, the sparring partner, that advanced from his corner, but Jimmy Torrance, champion heavyweight boxer of a certain famous university. But why enter into the harrowing details of the ensuing minute and a half? In 30 seconds, it was unquestionably apparent to everyone in the room, including young Brophy himself, that the latter was pitifully outclassed. Jimmy hit him whenever and wherever he elected to hit, and he hit him hard, while Brophy, at best only a 2nd or 3rd-rate fighter, pussy and undertrained, was not only unable to elude the blows of his adversary, but equally so to land effectively himself.
and there before the eyes of half a dozen newspaper reporters, of a dozen wealthy young men who had fully intended to place large sums on Brophy, and before the eyes of his horrified manager and backer, Jimmy, at the end of 90 seconds, landed a punch that sent the flabby Mr. Brophy through the ropes and into dreamland for a much longer period than the requisite 10 seconds. Before Jimmy got dressed and out of the gymnasium, he, with difficulty, escaped a half-dozen more fistic encounters, as everybody from the manager down felt that his crime deserved nothing short of capital punishment. He had absolutely wrecked a perfectly good scheme in the perfection of which several $1,000s had been spent, and now there could not be even the possibility of a chance of their breaking even. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 13. Harriet Philosophizes. When Jimmy got home that night, he saw a light in the Lizard's room and entered.
"Well," said the cracksman, "how's every little thing?"
Jimmy smiled ruefully. "Canned again," he announced, and then he told the Lizard the story of his downfall, attributing the results of the third round, however, to Brophy's unwarranted action at the end of the second.
"Well," said the Lizard, "you certainly are the champion boob. There you had a chance to cop off a nice bunch of coin on that fight, and instead you kill it for yourself and everybody else."
"You don't think," said Jimmy, "that I would have put any money on that crooked scrap?"
"Why not?"
asked the Lizard, and then he shook his head sadly.
"No, I don't suppose you would. There's lots of things about you that I can't understand, and one of them is the fact that you would rather starve to death than take a little easy money off of birds that have got more than they got any business to have. Why, with your education in front, we two could pull off some of the classiest stuff that this burg ever saw."
"Forget it," admonished Jimmy.
"What are you going to do now?"
asked the Lizard. "Go out and hunt for another job," said Jimmy.
"Well, I wish you luck,"
said the Lizard.
"Maybe I can find something for you. I'll try, and in the meantime, if you need any mazuma, I always got a little roll tucked away in my sock."
"Thanks," said Jimmy, "and I don't mind telling you that you're the one man I know whom I'd just as soon borrow from and would like the opportunity of loaning to. You say that you can't understand me, and yet you're a whole lot more of an enigma yourself. You admit, in fact, that you're inclined to boast that you're a pickpocket and a safe blower, and yet I'd trust you, Lizard, with anything that I had." The Lizard smiled, and for the first time since he had known him, Jimmy noticed that his eyes smiled with his lips.
"I always had the reputation," said the Lizard, "of being a white guy with my friends. As a matter of fact, I ain't no different from what you'd probably be if you were in business and what most of your friends are. Morally, they're a bunch of thieves and crooks. Of course, they don't go out and frisk anyone, and they don't work with a jimmy or a bottle of soup. They work their graft with the help of contracts and lawyers, and they gyp a friend or a pauper almost as soon as they would an enemy. I don't know much about morality, but when it comes right down to a question of morals, I believe my trade is just as decent as that of a lot of these birds you see rolling up and down Mishbull in their limousines."
"It's all in the point of view," said Jimmy.
"Yeah," said the Lizard. "It's all in the point of view, and my point of view ain't warped by no college education."
Jimmy grinned. "Eventually, Lizard, you may win me over. But when you do, why fritter away our abilities upon this simple village, when we have all the capitals of all Europe to play around in?"
"There's something in that," said the Lizard. "But don't get it into your head for a minute that I am trying to drag you from the straight and narrow. I think I like you better the way you are."
"Did you ever," said Harriet Holden, "see anything so weird as the way we keep bumping into that stock encounter young man?" "No," said Elizabeth. "It's commencing to get on my nerves. Every time I turn a corner now I expect to bump into him. I suppose we see other people many times without recognizing them. but he is so utterly good-looking that he sort of sticks in one's memory. Do you know, said Harriet, that I have a suspicion that he recognized us. I saw him looking up at us just after that other person knocked him down, and I could have sworn that he blushed. And then, he went in and was entirely different from what he'd been in the 2 preceding rounds. Billy said that he's really a wonderful fighter, and there are not very many good fights that Billy misses. What in the world do you suppose his profession is, anyway? Since we first noticed him, he's been a hosiery clerk, a waiter, and a prize fighter. I don't know, I'm sure, said Elizabeth, yawning. You seem to be terribly interested in him. I am, admitted Harriet frankly. He's a regular adventure all in himself, a whole series of adventures. I've never been partial to serials, said Elizabeth. Well, I should think one would be a relief after a whole winter of heavy tragedy, retorted Harriet. What do you mean? Asked Elizabeth. Oh, I mean Harold, of course, said Harriet. He's gone round all winter with a grouch and a face a mile long. What's the matter with him, anyway? I don't know, sighed Elizabeth. I'm afraid he's working too hard. Harriet giggled. Fiddlesticks, she exclaimed. You know perfectly well that Harold Bince will never work himself to death. Well, he is working hard, Harriet. Father says so. And he's worrying about the business, too. He's trying so hard to make good. I will admit that he has stuck to his job more faithfully than anybody expected him to. Elizabeth turned slowly upon her friend. You don't like Harold, she said. Why is it? Harriet shook her head. I do like him, Elizabeth, for your sake. I suppose the trouble is that I realize that he's not good enough for you. I have known him all my life, and even as a little child he was never sincere. Possibly he has changed now, I hope so. And then again, I know as well as you do that you are not in love with him. How perfectly ridiculous, cried Elizabeth. Do you suppose that I would marry a man whom I didn't love? You haven't the remotest idea what love is. You've never been in love. Have you? Asked Elizabeth. No, replied Harriet. I haven't. But I know the symptoms, and you certainly haven't got one of them. Whenever Harold isn't going to be up for dinner or for the evening, you're always relieved. Possibly you don't realize it yourself, but you show it to anyone who knows you. Well, I do love him, insisted Elizabeth, and I intend to marry him. I never had any patience with this silly lovesick business that requires people to pine away when they are not together and bore everybody else to death when they are. All of which proves, said Harriet, that you haven't been stung yet, and I sincerely hope that you may never be, unless it happens before you marry Harold. End of chapter 13. Of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 14. In Again, Out Again. Jimmy Torrance was out of a job a week this time, and once more he was indebted to the Lizard for a position, the latter knowing a politician who was heavily invested in a dairy company, with the result that Jimmy presently found himself driving a milk wagon. Jimmy's route was on the north side, which he regretted, as it was in the district where a number of the friends of his former life resided. His delivery schedule, however, and the fact that his point of contact with the homes of his customers was at the back door, relieved him of any considerable apprehension of being discovered by an acquaintance. His letters home were infrequent, for he found that his powers of invention were being rapidly depleted. It was difficult to write glowing accounts of the business success he was upon the point of achieving on the strength of any of the positions he so far had held, and doubly so during the far greater period that he had been jobless and hungry. But he had not been able to bring himself to the point of admitting to his family his long weeks of consistent and unrelieved failure.
Recently, he had abandoned his futile attempts to obtain positions through the medium of the help wanted columns. "It's no use," he thought. "There must be something inherently wrong with me that in a city full of jobs I am unable to land anything without some sort of a pull, and then only work that any unskilled laborer could perform." The truth of the matter was that Jimmy Torrance was slowly approaching that mental condition that is aptly described by the phrase "losing your grip," one of the symptoms of which was the fact that he was almost contented with his present job. He had driven for about a week when, upon coming into the barn after completing his morning delivery, he was instructed to take a special order to a certain address on Lakeshore Drive. Although the address was not that of one of his regular customers, he felt that there was something vaguely familiar about it, but when he finally arrived he realized that it was a residence at which he had never before called. Driving up the alley, Jimmy stopped in the rear of a large and pretentious home, and entering through a gateway in a high stone wall, he saw that the walk to the rear entrance bordered a very delightful garden. He realized what a wonderfully pretty little spot it must be in the summertime, with its pool and fountain and tree-shaded benches, its vine-covered walls and artistically arranged shrubs, and it recalled to Jimmy with an accompanying sigh the homes in which he had visited in what seemed now a remote past, and also of his own home in the West. On the alley in one corner of the property stood a garage and stable, in which Jimmy could see men working upon the owner's cars and about the box stalls of his saddle horses. At the sight of the horses, Jimmy heaved another sigh as he continued his way to the rear entrance. As he stood waiting for a reply to his summons, he glanced back at the stable to see that horses had just entered, and that their riders were dismounting, evidently two of the women of the household, and then a houseman opened the door and Jimmy made his delivery and started to retrace his steps to his wagon. Approaching him along the walk from the stable were the riders, two young women laughing and talking as they approached the house, and suddenly Jimmy, in his neat white suit, carrying his little tray of milk bottles, recognized them, and instantly there flashed into recollection the address that Harriet Holden had given him that night at Feinheimer's. "What infernal luck!" he groaned inwardly. "I suppose the next time I see that girl I'll be collecting garbage from her back door." And then, with his eyes straight to the front, he stepped aside to let the two pass. It was Harriet Holden who recognized him first, and stopped with a little exclamation of surprise. Jimmy stopped too. There was nothing else that a gentleman might do, although he would have given his right hand to have been out of the yard. "You never came to the house as I asked you to," said Miss Holden reproachfully. "We wanted so much to do something to repay you for your protection that night." There was no use in my coming," said Jimmy, "for, you see, I couldn't have accepted anything for what I did. I couldn't very well have done anything else, could I, under the circumstances?"
"There were so many other men in the place," replied Harriet, "but you were the only one who came to our help."
"But the others were not—" Jimmy had been upon the point of saying "gentlemen," but then he happened to think that in the eyes of these two girls, and according to their standard, he might not be a gentleman either. "Well, you see," he continued lamely, "they probably didn't know who you were."
"Did you?"
asked Elizabeth. "No," Jimmy admitted. "Of course, I didn't know who you were, but I knew what you were not, which was the thing that counted most then."
"I wish," said Harriet, "that you would let us do something for you." "Yes," said Elizabeth, "if $100 would be of any use to you."
Harriet laid a hand quickly on her friend's arm.
"I wasn't thinking of money," she said to Jimmy. "One can't pay for things like that with money, but we know so many people here we might be able to help you in some way if you are not entirely satisfied with your present position."
Out of the corner of his eye, Jimmy could not help but note that Elizabeth was appraising him critically from head to foot, and he felt that he could almost read what was passing through her mind as she took stock of his cheap cotton uniform and his cap,
with the badge of his employer above the visor. Involuntarily, Jimmy straightened his shoulders and raised his chin a little. "No, thank you," he said to Harriet. "It is kind of you, but really I am perfectly satisfied with my present job. It is by far the best one I ever have held." And touching his cap, he continued his interrupted way to the wagon.
"What a strange young man!" exclaimed Harriet. "He is like many of his class," replied Elizabeth. "Probably entirely without ambition and with no desire to work any too hard or to assume additional responsibilities." "I don't believe it," retorted Harriet. "Unless I am greatly mistaken, that man is a gentleman. Everything about him indicates it. His inflection, even, is that of a well-bred man." "Utterly silly!" exclaimed Elizabeth. "You've heard him speak scarcely a dozen words. I venture to say that in a 15-minute conversation he would commit more horrible crimes against the king's English than even that new stable boy of yours. Really, Harriet, you seem very much interested in this person." "Why shouldn't I be?" asked Harriet. "He's becoming my little pet mystery. I wonder under what circumstances we see him next." "Probably as a White Wings," laughed Elizabeth. "But if so, I positively refuse to permit you to stop in the middle of Michigan Boulevard and converse with a street sweeper while I'm with you."
Jimmy's new job lasted 2 weeks, and then the milk wagon drivers went on strike, and Jimmy was thrown out of employment.
"Tough luck," sympathized the Lizard. "You sure are the Calamity Kid. But don't worry, we'll land you something else. And remember that partnership proposition is still open."
There ensued another month of idleness, during which Jimmy again had recourse to the help wanted column. The Lizard tried during the first week to find something for him, and then occurred a certain very famous safe robbery, and the Lizard disappeared. End of chapter 14.